If you had a situation where there were no laws and no police force, what you would have would be rich people would form private armies, and they would become government. Which, of course, if you look back in history, that's what used to happen. You would have these warring tribes with their local baron, and they might go to war with the neighboring baron sometimes and try and take over the territory. So if you were one of the serfs in that kind of a world, you were essentially worth nothing. You were almost literally cannon fodder.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Chatter. Before we get started, I just have a few quick messages. First off, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It's the best way that you can help us grow. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. It's going to help us rank higher and get more and more views and therefore bigger and better guests. Links for everything will be in the description below. So please enjoy the podcast. Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am back with economist Mark E. Thomas. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be back.
Yeah, not a problem. It's great to have you back. I really enjoyed our previous conversation, and I think I've cited you in like one of every 3 podcasts I have done since because you did such a great job the last time of laying out a lot of the problems that Britain is facing that's sort of built up over a long period of time. So yeah, it's great to have you back to chat about some more stuff.
Great to be back.
So one of the things you have been talking a lot about recently is the NHS privatisation. So we've currently got the health and social care bill making its way through Parliament, and we can get to that in a minute. But I thought we'd maybe just start with where NHS privatisation sort of begins for you. Like, where does that story start, and where has that led us to now in the situation we're at before this bill gets potentially passed?
Well, the NHS has never been completely national because GPs have always been not actually employees of the NHS. They traditionally used to be either sole practitioners or in partnerships. So it's never been 100% NHS as NHS employees. But what we've seen is that over time, and particularly over the last 40 years, there's been quite a determined move to get health and social care so that instead of being a universal service, which is paid for by progressive taxation and available to everybody free at the point of use, increasingly people are having to pay for things themselves. So when we talk about privatisation, the government always denies that it has done any privatisation or has any intention of doing any privatisation in the future. But if you think about privatisation, actually there's not just one way of doing it. I think it's true that they are not going to turn the NHS into a PLC and then sell it in a trade sale or float it on the stock market. That's true. They're not going to privatise it in that way. But there are 3 other ways that they can make people pay privately for their healthcare. So one way is something they've been doing a great deal of, which is contracting out. So large numbers of things which used to be done by NHS employees are now done by private companies. So if you call 111, you'll be speaking to a private company. If you ride in an ambulance, you'll almost certainly be riding in an ambulance which is owned and driven by people who are employed by a private company.
Wait, what? Really? Like most of the ambulances?
Yes, I think so.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, wow. And many other services. So in itself, that's not necessarily a disaster, because you're not charged if you call 111. You're not charged if you go in an ambulance, whereas in the States you would be charged, maybe $3,000 for an ambulance. So it's not as bad as that. But the problem is the argument for contracting out is supposedly that it's much more efficient. But what we've seen in particular during the pandemic is that it can be vastly more inefficient. So the government ministers got personally involved in the procurement of personal protective equipment for staff. And they have wasted, according to the Department of Health's own figures, the best part of £10 billion of our money. And the reason they wasted it was because they didn't procure from companies that had a proven track record. They set up a VIP lane where contacts of ministers and party donors and people could put in bids. So some big bids were won by companies which had nothing whatsoever to do with personal protective equipment. One of them was a private office for a very wealthy family. But essentially, it's like a kind of personal bank that exists to make that company richer. And because they had contacts with ministers, they were then able to act as the intermediary for a huge contract, which was about 250 million pounds. And they got somebody to provide equipment, most of which was unusable. It wasn't actually usable. So huge amounts of money going to favoured people in the corporate sector who are well connected with ministers or big party donors, crowding out the suppliers who could actually have done it. So not only is it a huge loss of money, of our money being given probably illegally. I mean, these cases are still going through the courts, but our money being given to these donors and contacts of ministers, but also at a time when that equipment was desperately needed. It wasn't getting through because the warehouses were filling up with unusable stuff. So lots of needless deaths caused by it as well. And of course, if you think 10 billion is a lot of money, then 37 billion, which is the amount in total that was earmarked for the test and trace system, is of course an even larger amount of money. It's actually a mind-blowing amount of money to have spent on a test and trace system. When I was looking at it, I was trying to think, well, how much money is 37 billion? It's completely outside my experience, and I dare say your experience as well, to have anything remotely like that amount of money. So I tried to think, well, what would you expect to buy with that? And I discovered that if you add up the annual budgets of the three armed forces, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, that's 39 billion. So the amount that they have earmarked for test and trace was effectively the same as 1 year's budget for all three armed forces. And when you walk around the country, you see the evidence of that. You see people in uniform, you see jets flying overhead or helicopters or cargo planes. You see people in khaki lorries. You occasionally see tanks being moved around. You see the evidence everywhere. If you're by the coast, obviously, you see frigates and destroyers and occasional aircraft carriers. So, you can see where billions goes. But you can't see where billions have gone, and certainly not tens of billions in the case of test and trace. And when the National Audit Office looked at it, they concluded it was failing. So not only did they spend vastly more than you would expect, again through these VIP lanes, but they ended up with a very, very expensive service that didn't really work. And again, that results in loss of life. So it's not just that they're plundering the public purse, it's also that they're completely careless of the loss of life that this causes. So that's contracting out. That's the reason why contracting out isn't good. Then they can throw you out. So a few years ago, your GP could prescribe over-the-counter medicines to you. And so if you were poor in particular, that was very valuable because you got a prescription and you took it to the pharmacy and you got your over-the-counter medicines. Now you have to buy them, and they're typically not the most expensive medicines, but nevertheless they're not cheap, especially if you're having to take them regularly. So people have been thrown out, and over time we've all been thrown out. When I was a child, for example, glasses. And probably contact lenses weren't such a thing, but glasses were on the NHS. Now they're not. The dentistry is not really available on the NHS now. It is in principle, but it's quite hard to get it now. So you can be thrown out. And the last way is that you can be squeezed out. So simply by making sure that the NHS is underfunded, which they've been doing for 10 years, waiting lists have built up. So we've now got record waiting lists of about 6 million people. And that means that people who have perhaps not life-threatening conditions, but painful conditions get squeezed out and they go private. So last year, for the first time ever, more people had hip replacements done privately than on the NHS. Now, a hip replacement can cost anything from £8,000 to £15,000. So if you're wealthy, it's a huge expense, but you can afford it. So you've been squeezed out. If you're poor, you're just still waiting. You're still in great pain every day, waiting for 2 years for your hip replacement. So it's true, in other words, that the government probably isn't going to do that great big sell-off, but they have been contracting out, they have been throwing us out, and they have been squeezing us out. And those are all ways of expanding the scope of the private sector in UK healthcare. And if you want to know why they're doing it, well, if you look at the American system, it is the worst system in the developed world.
Actually, Mark, can we pause there, because I want to like clarify a few things you've said there just for people, and then we can go on to the why. So, sorry to stop you in your tracks, but I just thought that was the best place to get a pause there. So I just wanted to pull up a couple of articles for people here that I have been looking at that were just to sort of confirm and add to a few things you've said here. So I'm not sure you'll be able to see them, but I'm going to read out what the important part is. So this is from The Guardian. There was an investigation 5 years ago after £63 million contract was handed regarding ambulances, and there was patients left waiting. But then the stunning part is from LBC. So this is from 2019 now. That we now spend £92 million on private ambulances per year. Now that's 2 years ago, so we don't really know what the number is now. And then that number was just absolutely stunningly in 2011 just £400,000, which and that's from Full Fact. So I mean, it's amazing how much we spend on that. I can't get over it. And to your point about the NHS test and trace scheme, I'm not sure if this is accurate, but I did see this trope going around that it was one of them. I think it was the fourth most expensive singular project in human history, behind the US Interstate Highway, the International Space Station, and the King Abdullah Economic City, which I'm not sure where that is. But to build a whole city, 69 billion, and then next comes the test and trace system. Wonderful. It's stunning, and we will get to the looting of the British taxpayers' money in a minute. But back to, why are they trying to privatise the health service?
Well, the short answer is profit, because the US system is vastly more expensive than ours. It costs about 2.5 times as much per person to provide healthcare in the US as it does here. But it's also vastly more profitable. So it's a disaster for taxpayers in America. It's a disaster for citizens who are patients, because they don't get the same quality of coverage. And 2/3 of American personal bankruptcies come from medical bills, because even if you've got insurance, you still get these huge bills. So 2/3 of people who go bankrupt do it because of medical bills. Or to put it another way, 3 times as many people go bankrupt as they would if they had a system like ours. So if we were to migrate to the American system, we would have 3 times as many bankrupt people, 3 times as many people, therefore probably in poverty, as we do now. But it would be a £28 billion per annum, $28 billion, per annum profit opportunity for US healthcare corporations, many of whom are tightly connected with the people who've been pushing this legislation. So that's the reason they can smell the money. Yeah.
And the part that concerns me about it is, so I'm a big fan of Naomi Klein's work. I feel like I brought that up last time. But so she talks about using crisis to force through privatization and to sell off state assets, and I don't know if we have a bigger crisis than we could possibly have than the last 2 years, and I see people's attitudes changing and shifting and just being like, well, if it doesn't work, we may as well get rid of it. And I see that way more than I used to, like way
absolutely.
more.
And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that, of course, the NHS has had COVID thrown at it. And not only did it have COVID thrown at it, but it had COVID with a very, very bad anti-COVID strategy. So, New Zealand has had fewer deaths in the whole of the pandemic than we had today. Many fewer, actually. So, if you compare the way they handled it with the way that our government has handled it, they threw something at the NHS that no healthcare system in the world could have withstood. So, of course, that crowds out other things, plus the 10 years of underfunding. So people are, the waiting lists are at 6 million, and that means people are disgruntled, because if you imagine if you needed a hip replacement, it is very painful when you need a hip replacement. And if you've been waiting now for 2 years for your hip replacement, then you start to wonder, why is the NHS not giving it to you? And then the Daily Mail in particular launched, and I think the Spectator launched, a really vicious propaganda campaign, effectively blaming GPs for the fact that you might not be able to get an appointment when you want one. And so people in the NHS have been suffering abuse and even physical abuse whipped up by this kind of thing. But the bigger danger is that, as you say, it gets people used to the idea, well, it doesn't really work anymore, so we've got no choice but to privatize it. And the real danger is if they do destroy the NHS, it'll be impossible to get it back, because the story they will tell is that, we tried really hard for 75 years, but in the end it didn't work, so we had to get rid of it. And it'll be very, very hard to reinstate it. So it's vital that we don't let it go. And the reason I'm saying that with such passion is because the health and care bill that you mentioned earlier, is actually in the House of Lords now. It's in the committee stage, which means that very shortly the Lords will be voting on their amendments within probably a week or so, and then it will go to the Commons for the Commons to vote on the Lords' amendments. So obviously we are hoping, and indeed we've been campaigning, we've been writing to the House of Lords about the sorts of amendments that are needed to protect the NHS from this bill. And we are hoping then that we can get hundreds of thousands of people to write to their MPs. So we have a campaign jointly with a number of other organisations, Every Doctor UK, Gov2 UK, Nurses United, the Quakers, Keep Our NHS Public, Open Britain, and hopefully the BMA and others will come on board, to try to get as many people as possible to write to their MPs and say, you're not getting our vote if you destroy our NHS or you allow it to be destroyed. So the time is urgent now.
Yeah, and I believe Julia Patterson, from Every Doctor, who I had on the show last year, has been doing a lot of work on this as well. So yeah, credit to her, despite what many people think of her. She's very fierce.
Her organisation are involved. It's not her personally; it's one of her colleagues who's involved. But
okay,
yes, so they're in.
So yeah, it's because I think that the point that people miss, and the part that I think is holding back Britain from becoming the absolute just lunatics asylum that America is one of the things is legitimately the fact that we can all get healthcare, and that's just, and it's so alien to me to think that I couldn't. Do you know what I mean? That I couldn't just go to the hospital and get treated if there was something wrong. But that's the reality.
Exactly. That is the reality. That you hear these terrible stories of people who get into an accident and say, no, don't call an ambulance. I can't afford an ambulance. That's unthinkable in this country. But it can happen. And it won't happen the day after the bill is published. What the bill does is effectively, it's simply a power grab by ministers. So it doesn't say, we're going to privatise this, or we're going to privatise that. In that sense, it's quite a clever bill. What it really does is it gives them absolute power over the NHS, so they can do what they like to it over time without any scrutiny from the courts, without any scrutiny even from Parliament. If you try reading the bill, you won't see anything in there about privatisation at all. All you will see is stuff about governance. All it is a power grab, but it just gives them absolute power. And the House of Lords committee, they have a committee to look at disguised legislation. And they said this bill was one of the worst examples they've ever seen. Precisely because it removes the ability of Parliament to scrutinise what ministers are doing. So if the bill goes through, nothing will change the day afterwards. But over time, they'll be able to do effectively what they like with it. They can reduce coverage of it. They can put the power to take decisions in the hands of corporations, who will then stop providing services which aren't profitable, and they've stopped providing them in places where they aren't profitable. So we've already seen with GP surgeries, some of them have been bought by corporations. And some of them, if you look at them from the point of view of a business, they are not profitable businesses. So they've closed the surgery. That's what businesses do. And this is an inevitable thing, because if you're a company director under the Companies Act, you have a duty to the members of the company, which means your shareholders. So if you've got an unprofitable business, you're not allowed to sit there and say, well, it's providing a public service, so I'll keep it. If you could maximize profit by closing it, you have to close that surgery. And it's bad enough when it's a surgery, but imagine if it's your hospital, your local hospital, which is no longer profitable.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's been the rationale for trying to close down a couple of different local hospitals in Northern Ireland, at least. So yeah, it does happen. It's not just like this abstract thing.
It's not abstract. And it probably wouldn't always be whole hospitals, but you can think of it in terms of services. Something like a hip replacement, you can do it privately and make a profit out of it. You just make sure you charge between 18 and 15K per person and you make a profit. So that's fine. Cancer treatment is hugely expensive. It goes on for ages. Surgery, you're in and out in a day or two. Cancer treatment goes on for months, hugely expensive. So that might just become a bit unprofitable for people.
Yeah. I think that the problem is, for me, is that there are a lot of things in this world in which the market and profitability and capitalism are really fantastic at doing. But I don't think it should be the highest priority in healthcare. And because it leads to some really awful decisions and outcomes that are just sort of
it goes against the idea of a right. So if you compare healthcare with buying a Rolls Royce, you can see where capitalism makes sense and where it doesn't. It makes perfect sense for cars to be built by capitalists, because not everybody should have a right to drive a Rolls Royce. So if you have the money to buy a Rolls Royce, why not buy one? And if you haven't, then you buy something different. But with healthcare, you don't want it to be like that. You don't want to say, well, Mark's better off than Josh, so he has a right to more healthcare than Josh. You want to say, well, they've got equal rights to healthcare. That's not how it works if you start having people paying for their healthcare.
Yeah, and that it goes to then you get into this horrible position where the entire industry has to fund, you're adding in the cost of the insurance industry to your healthcare. That money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. All those groups have to make profit, and also it is almost inevitable that they get involved in the governance. And indeed, there's a huge risk with this bill that they will, because of these integrated care systems, integrated care boards, some of which already exist, and some of them already have corporate members sitting on them. So there's one in the Southwest which has the local CEO of Virgin Care sitting on it. So, the idea that we're not going to have private sector motivated decisions in these ICBs unless the bill is amended, it's just clear nonsense. The government denies it, but it's what they say is simply not true.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're so truthful on every other topic that we should just
Yes.
take their word for it, right?
Yeah, you do need a little bit of salt to hand, don't you? So that you can have the odd grain here or there.
Just
Yes.
a touch. So, like one of the themes you were talking about from at the beginning there is this the contracting out, the VIP lanes for the PPE, the just the handing of obscene sums of money to friends and donors of the cabinet. Like,
yes,
I am just blown away when I think about how that's a banana republic. Like, that is literally like an oligarchy.
well, it is, and I think you're not the only one who's blown away. A lot of journalists seem not to have woken up to what this government is doing. You hear people talking about big state and small state. You know, traditionally the left would say the state has an important role in providing things, and the right would say yes, it does, but by and large, private sector is more efficient, so we should try and keep the state small and get the private sector to do everything. And that's if you like, that's the traditional argument. Now, of course, we've got the highest taxes in 70 years, I think it is, in this country. And some journalists are writing about that as though, well, maybe Johnson is the one nation Tory who's trying to steal. But I've read articles saying this, actually. I know it sounds laughable, but this is what some journalists are saying, that he's trying to steal Labour's clothes, and all this levelling up is going to steal Labour's clothes. That is complete nonsense. He's not levelling up at all. He talks about levelling up with every breath. And indeed, I think today he said it was the defining mission of the government, in which case the government has manifestly failed on its defining mission. But they have no intention of doing that. What they're building is a plunder state. So it is different from traditional Toryism. They're not trying to just shrink the state. They're actually saying, well, it's perfectly fine to have quite high taxes as long as it's not the richest people who are paying those taxes. So when you look at how they chose to raise taxes, well, they reduced some taxes on banks. They didn't try and close any tax loopholes at the top. They did increase national insurance, which hits all normal working people. So in other words, they're taking the money out of the middle of the population and funneling it to the very, very wealthy. So it's a plunder state. So they're quite happy to see a big state, and 37 billion for the test and trace. That's a big amount of money. They're perfectly happy with that because they like where it goes. It goes to their friends, and then I'm sure in some circuitous route, some of it will come back to them. So this is different. This is not just Tories being Tories. This is, as you say, it's a deeply corrupt, institutionally corrupt government, which is doing something different. And that's part of the problem, because people just can't really believe anybody would do that. Now, the evidence is becoming clearer day by day by day, but nevertheless, a lot of people who've always voted Tory, they can't really believe it. They won't believe it until they've been told by enough Tory MPs that it's true, which might be starting to happen now, but it's obviously that's a very bad way of getting your information about what the Tory party is doing if you only believe it once you've heard it from a Tory. So yes, I think you're absolutely right, and also I think you're right to raise the shock doctrine point earlier, because clearly they saw the COVID epidemic as one of those crises that they could exploit. And so we are talking about, in total, the best part of 40 billion, at least. That's roughly 40 billion that we know about.
Yeah.
That's not counting all the things that we've got no idea about that are going on, which they've managed to plunder in 2 years. That's really moving fast and taking full advantage of the opportunity opened to turn Britain into a banana republic.
Yeah.
So Ken Clarke made the point that we are not so far from living in an elected dictatorship. the reason they want us to be in an elected dictatorship is to give them unfettered freedom to do that. If it's effectively a dictatorship, they can do what they like. We can't challenge them in the courts. We can't challenge them in any other way. So, we might be unhappy, but what do they care?
Yeah. Well, we can't rely on the opposition these days. But anyway,
at least they're scoring a few points now.
Well, yeah, they are at least finally. I mean, talk about setting them up for the volleys. We mentioned this a little bit before we started. Was this idea of the authoritarian scale, like everything from no government at all to Soviet Russia or, modern day China or something super duper extreme. So where would you say, if you had to give it like 1 to 10, maybe, where would you say the UK are on that scale?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the idea of no government at all, of course, doesn't mean that there would be no power at all.
No.
If you had a situation where there were no laws and no police force, what you would have would be rich people would form private armies, and they would become government. Which, of course, if you look back in history, that's what used to happen. You would have these warring tribes with their local baron, and they might go to war with the neighboring barons sometimes and try and take over the territory. So if you were one of the serfs in that kind of a world, you were essentially worth nothing. You were almost literally cannon fodder. So to a large extent, you want to have a government which can protect people from the rich and powerful. That should be one of the principal jobs of government. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin had a phrase that I really like. He said, "Freedom for the wolves often means death for the sheep." So, if you think of the wolves as the oligarchs, the more freedom they have, the more death there will be amongst the sheep. Mm-hmm. So you want a government which will protect normal people from the oligarchs. So you actually want quite a strict system of government, because they're very skilled at finding every little loophole. And if you think about competitive sport, every sport has a referee, and the rules are usually quite strict, and the penalties for breaking the rules are strict, because we know what happens when that doesn't happen. With the Tour de France, for example, if you look at the winners board, you'll see there's 10 years when there's no winner listed. Several of those years, the winner was Lance Armstrong. At the time, was considered to be the winner. And of course, he was stripped because he had been taking drugs. But the problem was, it wasn't just that he was personally corrupt, but he'd corrupted the whole system. People knew that if they wanted to compete against Lance, they were going to have to do it. So they couldn't just say, well, we'll give it to whoever was number 2 that year, because that person was almost certainly taking drugs as well. So
yeah.
when you allow the system to become corrupt, it might start with a few corrupt people, but if you're not careful, then everybody else who isn't corrupt feels like the mugs. Well, why am I the only one who's paying my taxes? Why am I the only one who's sticking to the law? And you can see it must have been like that inside Downing Street. If everybody else is partying every night, you feel like a mug if you're obeying the law. Yeah. They clearly did have that attitude in there, despite the fact that they were laws that they themselves had probably helped to draft. So you want this. You want a system which functions, and actually, where the rules are strict and where the rules are enforced. This is, of course, the most important bit, on everybody equally, that nobody would be above the law. So if you're at either end of that spectrum that you described, you've got people above the law. In Soviet Russia, Stalin was clearly above the law. And in the lawless world, the barons or the gang leaders or whatever it's going to be, they are above the law. So it's only in the middle that you really have a functioning rule of law, which is where I would like to see the UK going. Actually, I think where we're going is closer to the gangland thing, where we have a small number of powerful oligarchs who are above the law effectively, and the politicians are above the law. And if we're not careful, we end up in that situation where the rest of us are really cannon fodder, and the game will be to plunder all the wealth from those that have it, which is the middle half of the population upwards, until that's in the hands of the top 0.01%. And if you go back to the early 1900s, the percentage of the wealth that was in the hands of just a few hundred families was extraordinarily high, and almost everybody had almost nothing. Now we're in a situation where about 30 or 40% of the population has almost nothing, but most of the population still has some wealth. Lots of people do still are able to own a house. Not everybody, and in particular, it's getting harder and harder for people. So if we don't change, then in 40 years' time, hardly anyone will own their own house. It will only be either people who are very wealthy or were lucky enough that they inherited one.
Yeah.
But
that becomes a really big problem in its own, because it
does.
It's
a huge problem, because owning your house is a kind of security. If you're still renting into retirement, then most people's income roughly halves when they hit retirement, and it could be worse. So you could have lived in a house for 30 years if you've been renting, and then you suddenly find, well, I can't afford to live in this house anymore. I've got to downsize massively. And wealth generally is a buffer. Things go wrong in people's lives, and if you've got savings, or you've got a buffer, then something goes wrong, your car breaks down and you have to replace it. It's a pain in the neck, you're fed up about it, but it doesn't ruin your life. If you've got no buffer and you need that car for work, you're really stuck. Your whole life could be ruined by the fact that your car has unexpectedly become a write-off. So it really is. It's a matter of being able to have a reasonable quality of life, having a dignified life, that people have a certain amount of wealth. I'm not saying everybody should have a private island, that nobody needs that sort of amount of wealth to feel comfortable, but people do need a certain amount. And the real risk is that certain amount will not be there, that very few people will have those sorts of comfortable, dignified lives. Most people will have lives of grinding poverty in 40 years if we don't change direction.
Yeah, I mean, if we don't change direction, I think things will fall apart faster than 40 years, unfortunately. I fear this point where the top 1% or even smaller fractions have so much of the wealth, and that so many people have so little of a stake in the economy and in just like the system, that they're just like, well, why would we not just burn the whole thing to the ground? And that's what I really fear more than anything is because I want things to change, right?
Yeah.
And I would like a soft, non-violent, very peaceful revolution.
Yeah.
But if we don't do that, that's...
No, I agree. In fact, there's a chapter in the book 99%, which looks precisely at that. It says, there are really only three questions about the economy and how it's going to be shared. Will the pie grow? Will it be shared fairly? And will we have a peaceful transition to our future state? So you've got three questions there. The answer to each one is yes or no. So there are only really 8 possibilities. And many of those possibilities are unattractive. The ones that we're heading for at the moment are not the attractive possibilities. So we do urgently need to change track.
Yeah. I mean,
and this government is. You talked about people getting fed up with it. The government is moving very fast, also not just on building the plunder state, but on dismantling democracy. So there are bills currently in Parliament. There's the election bill, which is on its second reading in the Lords, which is the one that, among other things, going to say that you can't vote unless you've got photo ID, which most older people do have, but quite a high proportion of poorer people and younger people don't have. In other words, it will disenfranchise precisely the people that won't be supporting the Tories. The Electoral Commission itself is under threat. There's a judicial review bill, which is going to make it harder for the courts to scrutinise anything. So we talked about this corruption with the PPE scandal and the test and trace. Well, at the moment, Good Law Project is taking the government to court about those things. But if the judicial review bill were to go through, then a future occurrence of this would be beyond the scrutiny of the courts. They would say, well, the courts have no jurisdiction on this kind of thing.
Wait a second. Is it just to ditch the entire concept of judicial review by citizens?
No, but it's to circumscribe it much more and give ministers much more discretionary power.
Okay.
It's a bit like the health and care bill. So they're quite clever with the way they draft these things. They don't say, with the healthcare bill, they don't say we're going to destroy the NHS or even any of the ingredients of that. All they do is shift the power. And it's the same with this, that it just shifts the power much, much more to ministers. And then, of course, there's the police bill, which is also in just returning from the Lords, actually, for final consideration of the Lords' amendments, which, depending on what happens, could mean that the UK is one of very few countries in Europe not to have the right of peaceful protest. That's something which is supposedly a human right. Britain's signed up to it as a human right, but we're about to make it illegal with quite stiff penalties, actually.
Yeah.
What happens if we do get to the point of violence is potentially extremely nasty.
Yeah, once you start criminalizing protest, that's a road that, I mean, and I really hope that all of the people who have been, the hundreds of thousands that are, well, at least tens of thousands that I've seen out at the anti-lockdown and vaccine passport protests across the UK, is like, these people need to be on the street for this. It is like, they wouldn't have the right to go and do that and stand and protest whatever they peacefully would like to do. They will not have the right to do that if this passes. And that is like, I'd love to see everybody who just, like, everyone that hates the government right now needs to realize that, like, we have bigger enemies to fight. Like, it's so,
yeah.
And I can't stress this enough to people. It's like, we need to not let this happen, because if this goes forwards, and those bills that you've mentioned, plus the online harms bill, and there's amendments, I cannot remember what it is, but they basically want to try and start prosecuting journalists under some sort of espionage.
That's right. There's another one which is going to make it harder for people to be whistleblowers, and journalists will find it harder to protect their sources. Exactly. So actually, they are being very systematic on this. They're looking at every single possible way that they can be challenged, from voting to protesting to writing articles to whatever, every single route, and they're looking at closing it down. So if they were to succeed with all of this, then, as Ken Clarke said, we would be living in an elected dictatorship.
Yeah. And then, so this brings us to, like, one of the things that I've really struggled with, particularly over the past year or so. Is this, so we're aware, both of us, of just how much this current government is attempting to undermine democratic norms, undermine the system of not quite checks and balances, but like the way our democracy and our system has functioned.
Yeah, exactly. Checks and balances.
And I watched this all happening at the same time in which we are being asked to give up some of those processes and some of our democratic rights and civil liberties in the middle of a pandemic. And I have really struggled to reconcile these two concepts, because on one hand I'm like, well, it's a pandemic. Like people are saying we gotta do lockdowns, or we have to do whatever the thing is and then on the other hand I'm thinking I don't want to give these crooks one iota more power. They don't need it. They will abuse it. And like, how have you gone about like trying to deal with that conflict?
Well, I think you're right. I think there isn't a perfect reconciliation, because if you take lockdowns, for example, at the time that we had our first lockdown, there was no real choice. It was the virus was completely out of control. People were dying at an ever-growing rate, and if nothing had been done, then by now we would have had probably about 400,000 people dead, which at the time would have been considered completely unacceptable. Now, we're getting on towards 200,000, and people seem to be inured to it. But at the time, we still had our civilized norms where we didn't think it was all right to kill the best part of 1% of the population. And indeed, other countries around the world have the view that it's not all right to kill a huge proportion of your population. So there was no choice but to do a lockdown, and that was the right thing to do. But this government found ways to abuse it, and that's the problem. So whereas if I were in New Zealand, they locked down faster and earlier. As a result, actually, they've had many fewer days of lockdown than we've had, because they, as Jacinda Ardern said, they went in hard and early. Mm-hmm. That means you stop the virus from spreading before it's spread so far. Whereas the later you leave it, the bigger a problem you've got and the more lockdown you need. So delaying it actually means you need more lockdown. So we've had more, despite the fact that our government has been more reluctant to do it. But also they have abused it. So we are in a situation where we have a government that we can't trust, either in its competence or in its intent. And that really does make it much harder for us as a country to tackle the disease effectively. And as a result, we do have, certainly not the worst in the world, but one of the worst COVID records in the world.
Yeah. I mean, New Zealand, I'm always reluctant to use as a comparison, just because they're so isolated and they are much more sort of self-sufficient, and it's a more sparsely populated place. But there's definitely no doubt that we could have done a lot of things a lot better.
But there are more densely populated countries than us which have done better. So, for example, South Korea is more densely populated than we are, but they've done better. I'm not interested in getting into how to deal with this debate. It's because they will last forever. But the main issue that we're trying to point out here is that, or that I'm trying to get at here, is that it's really disturbing to watch this happen in real time, because it's pulling on so many different aspects. So you're thinking, okay, I don't want the NHS to become overwhelmed. So I think perhaps, in this situation, a government theoretically should have the power to do X, Y, and Z for a limited period of time. But then I look at the people who are in power and I'm like, do I trust any of you? I wouldn't even trust them to carry my shopping in from the car. No, I agree. I think that is exactly the problem. So that even if they came out with a plan that I thought, well, this is a really good plan, I would still be concerned because I wouldn't trust them. Actually, the first lockdown for about 4 weeks, it was quite well handled, because they did the lockdown and within a few days they'd introduced a support package which was far from perfect, but was vastly better than not having a support package, including the furlough scheme and things like that. And
Do you
I
think
thought,
that's because they hadn't figured out how to exploit it yet?
yes, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. They were kind of bounced into it, and probably they said to the civil servants, right, give me a plan. And as a result, they got a good plan. Once they then had time to put their own sticky fingers into it, they were able to ruin it all. And so if it happened again that they produced a good plan for something, I would say, well, this is a good plan, but I actually do not trust them to implement it. And I do not trust them not to exploit every single loophole that this plan opens up for the benefit of themselves and their backers, because that's clearly what the evidence shows they have been doing. And so that means that they actually get less compliance from the citizenry than you would get if you were a trusted politician.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
less compliance with sensible healthcare measures means more deaths. So the lack of trust actually means more deaths.
Yeah. That's a well, that's a way of looking at it, isn't it? Anyway, so this loss of trust, and it brings me back to something you said earlier about how it's a power grab, and this is what I'm witnessing, and I've looked at the opposition who have been. Yeah, okay, so with the parties and recently they've been sort of a lot harsher on the government, you know, finally doing their job as being in opposition. But throughout this, and then when I've sort of thought, you know, Keir Starmer is looking more and more just like Tony Blair, who is just, it looks to me like the Labour Party is slowly morphing into another neoliberal party once again, after sort of flirting with maybe not going down that road with Jeremy Corbyn. They've like solidly gone, no, that's not the way we're going. Here's where we're at. And he really concerns me because, as I mentioned before we started, he's kicked out the former leader of the party, the person who brought, like, I would say probably 100,000 people to the party. Maybe more. I don't know actually what the figures are, but I know that the membership went up at least 100,000 whilst he was leader. It went up to close to 700,000, I think, at one point. But anyway, and it's down like I think 200,000 members or something now since Keir Starmer became leader, since it was this peak when Jeremy Corbyn was. But anyway, so I witnessed this happening, and then they bring in the MP from across the aisle, who has been in favour of everything they're meant to stand against. And I just look at it and go, like, are we living in a one-party state?
Well, I don't think so. I'm not a politician, so you should probably get your grains of salt ready for anything that I say about politics. But I don't think so. No, I think the government that we have now is not only different from the Labour Party, not only different from the Lib Dems, I even think it's very different from traditional one nation Toryism. I think it is a much worse animal than we've ever seen before. And so, you know, you might prefer one brand of the sorts of things we've had before to another. But really what I'm saying is I would take anything, even when I'm not actually a Tory, but I would much rather have a one nation Tory government than what we have now. I would then disagree with them on quite a lot of economic policy, and I would think they're not redistributing fast enough and so on. But, you know, I might be able to have some respect for them in certain ways. I absolutely don't have that trust for this government, and I do think any of the other parties would do a vastly better job. So I don't think we're in a one-party state in that sense. The risk is that we're in a one-party state in a different sense, though, because we probably talked about this last time. The ownership of our mass media is very, very heavily concentrated. And about 80% by readership and viewership and so on is in the hands of people who are extreme right-wingers. They are usually not even UK domiciled for tax purposes. So they are absolutely pushing this market fundamentalist philosophy where if you're wealthy enough, you should be free to do whatever you like. And those people, for example, the Telegraph, the Mail, the Express, they have been absolutely the backers of Johnson's brand of conservatism. And the problem is that they have a lot of influence. So despite the fact that it could well be that every single other party is united, in fact, I think they are, sort of in a sense, broadly united in saying that Johnson's government is dreadful, that might not be enough. And it's still possible that despite everything that we've seen in recent weeks and months, and despite what the polls are saying today, if all of those papers make a concerted attack, which would logically it would be on Keir Starmer in the same way as it was on Jeremy Corbyn, because obviously if you're the leader of the principal opposition party, then you're the one they have to demonise.
Unless, right, see, this is where I become concerned. Is like when Tony Blair came, when Tony Blair was coming along.
Yeah.
The papers were happy to, well, maybe not all of them, but The Sun, for example, and Rupert Murdoch primarily went along with him. And the establishment, for me, went along with him because he represented a brand of politics that would not hurt the pockets of the wealthy. And I fear that is exactly what Keir Starmer will do. And that is why I believe we're in a one-party state. I think we are not somewhere where there is a credible party suggesting that we can, enjoy some of the great benefits of consumer capitalism while having some wealth redistribution and trying to, as you often put it, like grow the pie for everybody. And that's where I think that we're really in trouble.
Well, it's very difficult. If I were leading the Labour Party, I would want to get elected. Mm-hmm. And do you know the concept of the Overton window? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
do you want to maybe explain it if people are listening and they don't know?
Yeah, I should explain it anyway. So the idea of the Overton window is that there's a sort of window of ideas that people are prepared to consider might be acceptable. So 10 years ago, if you'd said, look, the NHS isn't working, we really need to privatise it, that would have been outside the Overton window. But people can move it through, in a good way, through rational argument and convincing people with the facts, or in a bad way through propaganda. So we've seen the Overton window shift dramatically in the last 40 years, so that things that Margaret Thatcher couldn't say, although she did want to do, are now official government policy. And conversely, things that the Labour Party could say 40 years ago are now outside the Overton window. So if you want to be elected, you've got to be very careful that you don't talk about things which are here, which are outside the Overton window. You talk about things which are here, and you try to shift the Overton window. So that's the reason why I say that I can't really give you a perfect answer, because I'm not on the inside of Labour Party discussions, and I don't know what they would like to say if they didn't have this Overton window to worry about. And that's really the thing you would need to know to give a proper answer to your question.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll see that. So to finish up here, I wanted to talk about trying to find some ways to be positive about this, because we've been very doom and gloom here, So I was trying to think about ways to define this, and realistically, the thing that we're trying to imagine how we can make happen is to create like a beachhead or the thin end of the wedge for just, a better and more inclusive democracy and economic system. That doesn't have to mean all the crazy things that everyone thinks it does. Slightly less top heavy would be awesome. So exactly. How do we go there?
Well, so I actually do have slightly optimistic feeling about that, certainly much more optimistic than I was 6 months ago. And the reason is because I think people are beginning to wake up to the reality of where we're going. So as you say, what we've been talking about is doom and gloom, but it was even worse 6 months ago because all of that doom and gloom was true, but very few people were aware of it. So there was hardly any resistance to it in any of the media. If I spoke to people in general, they said, well, I don't really know what you're talking about. I don't think it's anything like that. Now I think people are waking up, and that is hugely powerful. You know, we haven't got 60 million people who've woken up to it, but we have got millions of people now who've woken up to it. And I think even within the Conservative Party, I think there were probably people who thought, well, you know, I never really liked Boris, but you know, he's good for winning elections, and we can do the right thing. You know, we can sort of control him once we've got him into power, which is of course the mistake that people made with Hitler. That he was allowed into power on the basis that they'd be able to control him, and then they found they couldn't. But I think, you know, we've seen that there are considerable numbers of Conservative MPs who not only privately don't like him, but actually think he needs to go now. And the question is when rather than if. So that is extraordinarily good news. I think that there is probably a much greater cross-party consensus on the need for checks and balances. So when I was writing the book 99%, I was looking particularly at the US and everything Trump was doing. And so I sort of put together these ingredients of a democratic reset that would be necessary. And I thought, actually, these are necessary in the UK too. But it wasn't so obvious then because I was writing that pre-Johnson. And now it is much more obvious. So when I started talking to people about it, they said, but, you know, you can't have discussions like that in the UK. We don't have a written constitution. That, you know, we've got an unwritten constitution. That's the way we do things. And I was never convinced by the argument that that's because we've done it that way, that has to be how we do it in the future. But you know, a lot of people had that frame of mind. And paradoxically, people used to say, well, you know, no UK government can bind a future government, so you can't have a constitution. To which I replied, well, if that's binding, then it proves you can have a constitution, and if it's not binding, then that also proves you can have a constitution. That's
brilliant. Oh.
So I think you can have one, and I think people are much more likely to be alert to the dangers now because, you know, we just listed all of the checks and balances that they're trying to dismantle. So now the idea that those checks and balances are vital and need to be protected doesn't seem far-fetched or like a worst-case scenario. It seems like a very, very real possibility. Somebody like Ken Clarke might not have agreed with me when I wrote the book, but I bet he would agree with me now. Maybe he would have done then, I don't know. But he clearly, from what he's been saying recently, he would agree now that, you know, these checks and balances are vital. So I think there's a much greater awakening to the need to address these sorts of constitutional matters. And once you do that, if you have a constitution with proper separation of powers, proper duty on ministers to look after the whole of the population, and then you start to formulate fact-based policy, you are bound little by little to see things improve. So you won't get a perfect system, and sometimes you get people that you don't agree with in power, but as long as they're playing by the rules, that's okay. It's when they start breaking the rules that, as we can see, that the problem comes. And you know, if you had a rapidly reforming government, it might, if you had the equivalent of the Clement Attlee government, obviously it would do far, far more good more quickly than a Harold Macmillan government would do. But actually, the Harold Macmillan government wasn't a disaster. He said in 1957, "You've never had it so good." And actually, that was true. If you look at the statistics, people at that time never had it so good as they had in 1957. So, if people are playing the game properly, you can have better governments and worse governments. And even with the worst governments, you can still be making progress. So that's what I want to see. I want to see not a perfect system, but a system where even when you've got the equivalent of the Harold Macmillan instead of the equivalent of the Clement Attlee, most people are still getting better off year after year.
Well, that seems like a very positive note on which to end. So, Mark, I want to thank you for your time. Everybody, you can check out Mark's website, the99percent.org, and his book, of the same title. So I will put links for those in the description below. So yeah, Mark, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. If you want to leave us a comment, that would be awesome. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening.